All right, everybody, let's finish us up some Mill. If you welcome back, if you're joining us again, so we got through a majority of John Stuart Mill already. Okay, let's close that. So the only one that's not on Twitch right now, I don't think Chapter 1 and 2 are on here. So I might do a makeup stream and add those back in case people need to know them. And by makeup, I mean I already did them in person. So they exist just in the minds of people and on my hard drive, not in real life. So today we're going to start with the last of Mill, and then we're going to jump into Intro to Das Kapital and who Marx is and that kind of thing. And let's make sure the stream is working. Looks like sound is up. Looks like we're live. Looks like the bitrate isn't horrible. Okay, great. And everything's open and ready to go. All right, here we go. So we left off on Mill 5. And actually we did examples too, if you weren't here or don't remember. So we did the application. And that, if you don't know what that is, that's the end of Chapter 4. Okay, so first thing, Mill starts Chapter 5, which is just called application. That's it. And the point of this is, so he just explained his philosophy for liberty, right? And how we have it, and what's the limit it has on the individual. But then it has to, and then he transitions by giving us examples. And now, to quote him, right, he says basically this is try to hold a balance between principles and examples. So the best way to execute any philosophy, right, it has to at some point be applied generally. Otherwise it doesn't make any sense. So the principles asserted in these pages must be more generally admitted on the basis of discussion of details before a consistent application of them to all various departments of government and morals can be attempted with any prospect of advantage. So, again, that's quoting Mill. It's this idea, I'm going to clean my desk up a little bit. It's that idea that you need to have a practical, like, show me how these would work in practice. Give me examples, give me allegories. If we can't do that, the philosophy in general is going to suffer. Any philosophy, right? So that's the first thing we got to do. So here we go. So he restates his general principle. Again, this is just recapitulation, right? He's reminding us. He just literally says it again, right? The maxima are first. These are his principles. So maxims are first principles. The maxims are, first, that the individual is not accountable to society for his actions insofar as these concern the interests of no person but himself. Advice, instruction, persuasion, and avoidance by other people, if thought necessary by them for their own good, are the only measures by which society can justifiably express its dislike or disapprobation of his conduct. Secondly, that for such actions as are prejudicial to the interests of others, the individual is accountable, and may be subjected to either social or legal punishments, if society is of the opinion that the one or the other is requisite for its protection. Now, I point this out because it's interesting. We'll get into weaknesses a little later, but you can kind of start seeing one here. If you remember that, like the last examples we talked about were actually examples of where opinion has a limit on people, but now he's saying that like opinion is, but the opinion is, the society uses the opinion to tell if it's been harmed by you or not. So there's a little bit of squish room here. What I mean is where it can be a little inconsistent in application. I just want you to keep that in mind. All right. Now this is interesting. He then points out, he gets into like how this isn't necessarily connected to free trade. Now, why would I point this out? Because a lot of modern liberty thinkers, like a lot of liberals and libertarians, will conflate trade and social liberty or personal liberty, and they're all the same thing. Mill's the first one to say they're related in the way, and here's the quote he says. Free trade, this is on bottom of 98. This so-called doctrine of free trade, which rests on the ground different from, although equally solid with, the principle of individual liberty asserted in this essay, restrictions of trade, or on the production for purposes of trade, are indeed restraints, and all restraint, qua restraint, is evil. But the restraints in question affect only that part of the conduct which society is competent to restrain, and are wrongly and solely because they do not really produce the results which is desired to produce by them. And then he also says, as the principle of individual liberty is not involved in the doctrine of free trade, so neither is it in most questions that arise respecting the limits of that doctrine. For example, the amount of public control admissible for the prevention of fraud, for example. So, he gets the point that they're not exactly the same, and even though they get conflated, it's good to remember that even though trade is a social activity and free trade can sound a lot like individual liberty, it's not the same thing. And it's kind of a different argument in that way, because trade is a social activity, so economic choices have a lot more externalities. So it's something to keep in mind. And that just means externality is the fancy word to mean you impact people who aren't you. So, we're literally in the middle of this virus, right? So what's the externality of the quarantine? Local businesses start to die. Or, I read the article in the local newspaper for Long Beach today, where I think 600 employees working at the university were laid off, right? That's an externality to closing the campus. So it's something to keep in mind. Now, now, do I have this on here? Oh, I do. Let's see. I don't have it on here. Okay, so a part that I didn't want to skip, he points out that part that isn't part of this is what he talks about is competition. Damage to your interest does not actually equal harm. And for him, this includes competition in merit. So society doesn't actually punish people for winning. So he says whoever succeeds in an overcrowded profession or in competitive examination, whoever's preferred but to another in any contest for an object with both desire, reap the benefit of the loss of others from their wasted exertion and their disappointment. But it is, by common admission, better for the general interest of mankind that persons should pursue their objects undeterred by sort of consequences. In other words, society admits no right, either legal or moral, in the disappointed competitors to an immunity of this kind of suffering, and feels called on to interfere only when it means success have been employed to the contrary of the general interest of the permit, namely fraud, treachery, or force. So basically all competition for Mill is fine, and it doesn't hurt society, because the general good of society is increased by competition, as long as there's not cheating in the said competition. So using force or treachery or fraud. Something good to keep in mind. Now, this is also the chapter where he gets pretty heavily in danger of the preventative function of government. Now, why does he point this out? Because a lot of the time the government doesn't prevent things. Like, think about police. Now, we live in a mixed time where, I would say since 2015, people have been kind of anti-cop. But now that cops aren't going to be coming as much, people might be pro-cop again. But there's a point here that there's a danger of relying on the state legally for preventative forms of government. Now, what does he mean by this? Well, how could you say it? Like, for example, how often do police prevent crimes, or do they show up and then try to get retribution? Tends to be much more retributive, right? They come to, punish things. And to quote him, he says the state is allowed to prevent you from doing something when the outcome, which is a negative outcome, is nearly guaranteed. In other cases, leave this to the person to discern. And the example he uses is for example, if a policeman's guarding a broken bridge, and you keep walking or driving on the bridge will literally kill you, the cops are allowed to prevent you from crossing the bridge. But that's a nearly guaranteed negative outcome. So, for example, let's be honest, Mill might even make that argument for our current disease quarantine, right? Do we have a guaranteed negative outcome? No. There's a probability of a negative outcome, but it's not 100%. So Mill might even be against something like the current quarantine we have, which, again, interesting. So, again, does that mean the quarantine's bad morally? I'm not saying that strictly speaking, but does that mean it's not good from a liberal perspective, like a liberty-focused perspective? Mill would say that's his point. Is part of it's your discernment to decide if you comply. Being compelled to comply is not great. And let's see. Oh, yeah, and we'll get to the next one. So then he gets into, what things can we perform? Well, he brings up drunk examples. The drunks come back a lot. So, for example, can we do preventative proof of harm if we're already doing something for drunks? So, the problem with condemning, say, for example, just drinking or just smoking is, for Mill makes a great point, and actually this is a older Catholic point. If you've ever heard the fancy word concupiscence, if you haven't, Don't worry. It's a very old-fashioned word. But everything can be bought and consumed in excess. So Mill's point isn't government shouldn't prevent the buying of a thing. It should be encouraging the regular consuming and the regular buying of the thing. So the preventative function of allowing you to buy too much of a thing. And he uses not just drunkenness, right? And we already talked about his answer to drinking. You should punish individuals for not being able to handle drinking by losing the right to drink. But don't punish all of society by banning drinking. Again, he would use this too for poisons, right? Like, we need poison to kill rats. But too much poison can kill a person. Or some drugs are poison in small doses. I mean, they're helpful in small doses and they're poison in large doses. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have drugs. It means we should have a reasonable application, if this makes sense. So Mill is very big on this, being much more fine-tuned and not over giving rights to the government. And then he talks about the problem of overregulation and the laboring classes. And let me find this here. Oh, and I skipped a part here. Hold on, let me go back. If you're writing anything, I think at least one person here wants to do a paper on prostitution. You should look at 102 and 103. Mill talks about kind of the argument for how you should make gambling or prostitution illegal and why maybe should or shouldn't you from a liberal perspective. It's a very interesting perspective because he points this to every increase in cost is a prohibition on vices. We're talking about things that are considered to be negative in society. So everything can be bought and consumed to excess. So everything could be a vice. So it's basically, and he points out why this can be kind of negative for working classes, is basically their choice of pleasures and their mode of expending their income after satisfying their legal and moral obligations to the state and to individuals are their own concern and must rest with their own judgment. And this is talking about why should we not regulate the size of a soda for laboring people. And remember, folks, most of us are laboring people. What does this mean? We work and get a regular salary. If that's you, you're laboring class. This includes me, by the way. Hi. So the problem with this overregulation is if people can do these two things, right? So if they can fulfill their obligation to the state and their moral obligations and to other individuals, why should the state tell them how to spend the rest of their money? For him, this is the problem with overregulation, especially for vices, because it goes back to, right, everything can be bought in excess. So to punish people for not fulfilling their obligations, like not taking care of their family, not paying their taxes. Don't punish people for consuming too much, or doing a thing you don't personally enjoy. All right, and he points this out too. One reason this book has so much work in principle is basically, he points out without general principles, liberty can't work. Do I have that here? Oh yeah, so a couple quotes here. He says, liberty is misapplied often. So, where's my, that's my footnote quote. I'll leave that one there. 108. Let's see. Here we go. This is on page 108 if you have your, which copy is this? The Modern Library Classics edition. I have already observed that owing to the absence of any recognized general principles, liberty is often granted where it should be withheld, and well as withheld where it should be granted. And one of the cases which, in modern European world, the sentiment of liberty is strongest, is the case where my view is altogether misplaced. Here we go. A person should be free to do as he likes in his own concerns, but he ought not to be free as he likes in acting for another under the pretext of the affairs of others are his own affairs. The state, while it respects the liberty of each that specifically regards itself, is bound to maintain vigilant control over his exercise of any power which is allowed to possess over others. This obligation is almost entirely disregarded in the case of family relations, in case direct influence over human happiness, more important than all others taken together. And then he goes into condemning what he calls the almost despotic powers of husbands over wives. And by the way, he was one of the basically general advocates both of slave abolition and women's equality. Just because, again, he pointed out, if you're not applying principles to women and men, it can't work. And if you're not applying it to different, categories of people in your society, it's also not working. So this is a good point. All right, another one. This is great. Diversity in education, aka why the government should not be in schools. So what does this mean? Well, the problem with state education is state education molds everyone. This is just the tendency of it, right? And what is it molding them like? To be the same. And he literally calls this, it establishes a despotism of the mind. So it makes sense in developing societies, this is what he says, but not in developed societies. Like once you've hit a decent level of, we'll say, affluence, it doesn't make sense anymore. And let's see. Somebody asked a question, which I'm actually going to answer here. The question was, how was he viewed by his peers for advocating for the abolition of slavery and the rights of women? Well, probably not everybody agrees, but to give you a little bit about his bio, right? His wife was one of the first feminists, if that helps. So he married, he lived his principles, basically. And within his lifetime, slavery was abolished. I'm pretty sure one reason we don't read that much about it in this book is his dad actually was one of the bigger anti-slave people in England. And I think by the 1830s, slavery was abolished in the United Kingdom and all its colonies. So it did it before the United States, and mostly just bought them out. They paid the slave owners to let their slaves go. So that fight had already been kind of won by the time On Liberty was out, but he would apply that principle to it had you asked him. So slavery was more popular than the rights for women. Again, resistance to the rights of women, but it's good to be careful whenever you study history of this kind of thing, because think about it this way. Who had to vote to let women have the rights? Men. And did those votes succeed? Yes. So, was it a horribly oppressing patriarchy, or did most people agree? Well, if it won in a democracy, right, it means most people agreed. So, people like Mill basically made the argument successfully for it, right? So apply your general principles to women too. So some people might not have liked it, but he was very influential and changed a lot of minds. All right. So back to diversity of education a little bit. Let's see. So why shouldn't the government take over schools besides the fact it makes us cookie cutter? He said, well, the problem is, he said, if the government's going to run schools, it should only do examinations, minimum general knowledge, and literacy. And it should be confined to facts and positive science, and not on truth or falsehood of opinion, but on facts. That's it. Anything else, basically, you require political teachers to teach. How can I say it? You basically get politics if you're not teaching fact. If you start teaching opinion, you're either teaching politics or ideology or belief systems. And for Mill, that should be up to the parents to decide, like a private education, right? Not for the state to pick. Because obviously, right? And he says this, all attempts by the state to bias conclusions in its citizens, basically, and he says, yeah, on disputed subjects is evil. Wow. So again, Mill doesn't always use the word evil a lot, but when the government tries to bias the conclusions of its citizens towards itself on anything that's not 100% settled, Mill finds it evil, because the government will always use its power to do that if it can. It's just the nature of a government. So again, going back to what he recapitulates, it teaches facts, lets students make their own conclusions, and how the government should help people, and let them by helping people by letting them figure out the conclusions for themselves. I'm sure that sounds exactly like all of your government education. Okay. Now, the evils of adding unnecessarily to government power. This is the second time, actually, where we get him using the word evil. Why? Well, there's a problem with what are his objections to this, and why would we be against government interference? And he points it out. There's basically three problems he has. First, things are generally, better done by individuals who have an interest in the thing they're doing. So, for example, if we're rebuilding our community and somebody 3,000 miles away has the job to rebuild our community, we're obviously going to care more about it. That's the point. And he says, number two, even if they do worse than the government, leave them alone for their own mental education. That's his point. And he mentions even jury trials, right? They might be worse, and it's like non-free association, but you can kind of try out new ideas and let normal people figure it out. And finally, the most cogent, this is interesting, the great evil of adding to its power of the government is that we'll lose our freedom in all but name. Even if the government's more effective, the more power we give to the government, the more we lose our liberty. And then what's wrong with this? Well, the more power the government has, it causes a feedback loop. And I love this. He says, once every skilled actor enters the government, the private sector cannot check it, because now all the talented people are in the government, so there's no check on the government power from the private sector. And he gives an example of the Russian Empire. That actually one factor that led to the Russian Revolution is that the government was so overbearing because the only place competent people would get jobs is the government. So there's almost a danger of too much competence in the government, which again is interesting. We don't ever really think about that. What's the danger of an overcompetent government? Is it basically can just take all freedoms for itself. And then finally, he gives two examples of people who manage themselves better. This is on 116. He talks about the French and the Americans. And if you want more detail, you should read it. And this is 150 years ago, but still, the United States had the reputation for managing themselves better. Oh yeah, and he points out too, if this ultimate power gets taken over by the government, eventually the principal ability of a country to govern itself it'll basically be fatally failed, because sooner or later the mental activity and the progressiveness of the body itself just sinks into routine, and then that once smart institution becomes routine and boring and useless. So you need watchful critique from an outside body for the government to ever keep itself going. And what was his solution? He was basically an advocate for dispersed local government and then centralized information. And then the state, where's this? Yeah. Oh yeah, this is a great quote at the end. You guys are going to love this. The state makes small men. With small men, no great thing can be accomplished. Oh, I love Bill so much. So he's definitely for human general flourishing. And there's this last quote I want to read. Where is this? It's the very end of his book, but it always hits me enough I got to read it. The worth of a state in the long run is the worth of the individuals composing it, and a state which postpones the interest of their mental expansion and elevation to a little more of administrative skill, or that semblance of it which practice gives in the details of business, a state which dwarfs its men in order that they may be more docile instruments in its hands, even for the beneficial purposes, it will find that with small men no great thing can really be accomplished, and that perfection of machinery to which it has sacrificed everything will in the end avail it nothing, for want of the vital power which, in order the machine might work more smoothly, it has preferred to banish. So somebody says, so he was for strengthening the federal government? No. So yeah, you said no, right? Yeah, no, he's not for a strong federal government. At best, and he's British, so he'd say a centralized information source, that's the central government, but let the local governments make their choices, and then don't give the government undue power, just because it'll keep taking power for itself, right? And it'll just make small people who are just cookie-cutter stamps, and then we literally would lose any government, not just, I shouldn't say we, but any government, in his view, would lose its ability to ever, to ever fix itself or progress or get any good critique, because eventually it necessarily will blot out that kind of thinking. All right, any questions before we move on? That was a good question. I see a ping. No, it's a different chat. Great. Okay, if there's no questions, or if you ask later, I will totally take them. And now we're going to switch. Where's my other one? Here we go. Great. And let's see if it works first time. It worked first time. Heck yeah. All right. So now we're going to move on. We're not going to even get close to finishing Marx today. We're going to start Marx. Just start. And hopefully you've at least heard his name. Hi, Marx intro. Here we go. Yeah, we're starting an intro to Karl Marx, folks. And we're going to jump in the deep end. And by that I mean we're reading his magnum opus written in the end of his life. Now, if you're in my class, you should have access to this. Let me show you. So this is the Marx PDF I uploaded. So it has the introduction, and it just keeps going. Whee! And this is what we're going to be reading. If you're a random community member, I'll show you this first page. This is the version of Capital we are using. So, Capital, Critique of Political Economy, Volume 1, and it's the Ernst Mandel introduction we're going to be reading. This is the Penguin Classics version, by the way. So it's like $15. It's pretty easy to buy. I'm sure there's PDFs online too. So we're going to be reading this today, and let's jump on in. All right. Here we go. Karl Marx. All right, and by the way, for clarity, I am going to call this book, he is German. I'm going to call the book by its German name, which is Kapital, so Das Kapital. Now why? Because in this book, his most used word is capital. So to clarify between the title of the book and the principle of capital, I will call it Kapital, the book, and capital, the part of the economy. So just so you know, when I say those two things different. So we're going to call it Das Kapital. But let's get into Marx a little bit. If you've only ever heard his name, let's jump in, we'll explain why. Now, I'll firstly explain why should we even care about him if we're talking about academic research. By far the most prevalent, let's see, in the last 200 years, Marx might be the most influential modern thinker. For sure. He died in 1900, by the way, so he's pretty recent. But for the modern thinkers, he is quite prevalent. And even now, most people argue with or against him, and even if you're not a Marxist or never heard of him, you probably use his concepts. So it's good to know when you uncritically use a Marxist idea, both if you agree or disagree with him. Alright, so where does he come from, and why do we do him right after Mill? Well, there's this, so basically, he's growth out of these three fields of thought, and I'll explain them a little bit. British liberalism. It's almost like we just studied this a little bit, yeah. So Mill is one of the, we'll call him like the middle figures of British liberalism. He's not the first, but he's one of the more important ones. So he's a hybrid of British liberalism, German idealism, and socialism. Now, you might be like, Professor, isn't socialism and socialism and Marxism the same thing? Well, nowadays they've become kind of synonyms, but at this time they weren't. Now, what are these three things really quick? Well, we did liberalism already, right? That focus on British liberty. German idealism is big two are Hegel and Kant. They basically, if liberalism is from a school called empiricism, which means you're trying to view data from reality, German idealism is a branch of romanticism, actually, but what that means is it's mind over matter. German idealists think that our minds, to some extent, can make matter, and more correctly, we can also access truth about the universe directly from our minds. We don't need experience first. This will be important later, but I just want to plant this seed. And at some point I might actually teach some Kant or Hegel in this class. And socialism. Now, what does socialism mean? Pre-Marx. Socialism comes out of what is called Catholic social teaching, which is still taught in most Catholic denominations. I mean, most Catholic, we'll say, flavors. That'd be the word I should use. But socialism is just care for the poor, right? Care for the orphans, care for the widows, care for the disenfranchised. Christians have been doing that for 2,000 years. The Marxists did not invent it. They just didn't like the religious part of it and tried to delete that. So before that, socialism just meant where society cares for the disadvantaged. That's all socialism meant pre-Marx. Nowadays, when you say socialism and Marxism, or socialism and communism, socialism now means trying to get, government ownership of the means of production through democracy or the form of government you have, and then communism means the violent revolution with the same ends. But there's actually a third meaning of socialism. But Marx is kind of won and took over the meaning. Unless you're Catholic, then you might know the difference. Alright, so he notes inconsistency, I say with both sets of ideas, but I should say all three. Now, when I say inconsistencies, what does this mean? Well, like I said, I like to represent everything from the perspective of the people who approach it. So Marx has problems with each of these, and I'll give you some examples. The biggest problem with British liberalism and the biggest problem with socialism before Marx. Well, British liberalism has a couple problems. The first problem is basically the assumptions under liberalism. Liberalism in general is basically dealing with economic freedom and, utility, and Individual rights. What is it not dealing with? Well, it doesn't really deal with emotional or moral philosophy in the same way. Why not? British liberalism assumes everybody's a Christian. So when you ask about, like, what's ethics and what do we do about emotions and aesthetics, liberals would say historically, oh, everybody's a Christian. So that's your ethical system. And Marx found that to be an inconsistency. Now, what's wrong with German idealism? Well, they didn't have enough focus on empirical reality, and Marx thought that was a weakness. And even now, you could say that's the biggest critique of German idealism. And what's the problem with socialism? It's the same problem that British liberalism had. It's inherently Christian. And Marx is one of the prominent atheists. So for him, any reliance on religion for taking care of people in society is insufficient for his material worldview. Now, I say material a lot. When I say material here, Marx is not a starter of it, but we'll call him a modern rebirth of the idea that there is no reality above the material reality. Material reality is all of reality. There isn't a spiritual reality or an intellectual reality. There's not a metaphysical reality. Everything in reality comes from material. That's a good first thing to know. All right. Now, I'll point this out too. Marx has a reliance on both of these major schools and socialism too, and especially liberalism. And he basically uses Christian virtues. We'll talk about this when we get there. But he basically takes out the God part of it, but he keeps a lot of the virtues. So I'll point this out, how this goes later. But he relies on both liberalism and German idealism together. But he doesn't like them fully, so he's trying to basically, what he would say is fix them. And these are the biggest three thinkers, I would say, he's influenced by. Hegel, who is one of the last major German idealists. Locke, who is a big British liberal, the founder of liberalism, actually. And then radicals. And if you want to know who a radical is, one of the two major radicals is John Stuart Mill. The other one's a guy named Bentham, but we'll focus on Mill. So radicals were the basically utilitarian liberals. Locke is the first British liberal, and Hegel is a German idealist. The socialists, just because he was in the 19th century, they kind of influenced him through the culture and the society. All right. So we're using this source. We're using Kapital in the introduction from the perspective of a true believer. One reason I use this introduction is that the translator, this is interesting enough, if we look at the date here, let me get this up. Here we go. So if you look at the date here, this was done in the 70s. Great. Now, why is that significant? Because this book is this translation and this introduction is written by a true Marxist believer who's German during the Cold War, when communism hasn't failed yet. So this kind of gives the most clear, we'll say from their own perspective, view of how a Marxist in kind of the heyday of communism viewed Marxism. All right. So this is not a one-to-one match to Manifesto. If you've ever read the Communist Manifesto, you might be like, something's missing. Why isn't it the same as Manifesto? Well, to quote Mandel, who's our translator and who wrote this intro, this is a later work, and it's basically what he calls mature Marx. So this is Karl Marx at the end of his life, after he's moved past just this small book of slogans for working-class factory workers. This is what he expects, like the academics and almost like the high priests of Marxism to read. Okay, and like Mill, subsequent thinkers tend to pick and choose as is politically convenient, and then so they can do the no true Scotsman fallacy. Now what this one is, it's basically when you're a group, if somebody critiques your group and you don't like the person who's in your group, you say they're not a real person of that group. So if you're a Scottish person and somebody talks about a bad Scottish person, you say they're not a true Scotsman. Or if you're a Marxist and people misrepresent your philosophy, you just say, oh, they're not a true Marxist, or that's not true communism. But millions also do it too, right? Oh, that's not true liberalism. It's not our fault it failed. They didn't execute it right. If you've never heard that with a communist, I don't know what you're doing with your life. All right. Now, regardless of your opinion of Marxism, it's good to understanding it's critical because it's still responsible for major streams of modern political and academic thought. We're still having a lot of Marxist arguments nowadays. And, like even we do Asian studies, right? In Asian studies, most Asian universities in Asian languages are heavily Marxist. And you might say, Professor, does that mean like communist China is the most heavily Marxist? They're pretty heavily Marxist. They actually have a lot of liberal, they had anyway, until the last new president, they had a lot of liberal academics too. But for example, if you studied history in Japan, just to give you an example, 90% of Japanese historians are Marxists in their approach. They use Karl Marx as their methodology. Very important to realize this. So it's hugely influential in the Asian studies field. Now, within the last, I would say since 1995 to now, in America, probably in Asian studies, Asian American studies, you have much more postmodernism than pure Karl Marx, 19th century Marxism. But again, they use a lot of the Marxist lingo, and I'll give you examples of this too as we go forward. Like, what kind of words do they use? How do you know if you're dealing with a Marxist? Like, what? Like, I mean, what is their lingo? What does it mean? All right. Any questions about this so far? Any questions? This is all me, by the way. This is not in the article we're using. So if it seems like, Professor, are you making this up? Oh no, this is me. This is basically my summary of the philosophy. And how would I know this? I basically read and teach philosophy every semester. That's how I teach the whole history of Western philosophy. And if you read that enough, you realize this naturally grows out of, you see where Marx grows out of the ground he was planted in, basically. All right. Waiting for questions. I do not see any. Fantastic. If you have delayed questions or my stream delay is really bad, I can always go back. Don't worry. All right, I gotta open my stuff again. Oh, there we go. Another one of those. All right, let's jump into Marx's Capital. And again, in German, it's Das Kapital. Now, if you don't, Das just means the capital. That's what Das is in German. So now you know a little bit of German. Okay, so let's jump right in. Oh. Okay, somebody asked, what were the inconsistencies of German idealism again? Well, there's a lot of them, but basically the broadest critique of what is called continental thought, that is European thought, which tends to be broadly idealist. It tends to be idealistic or romantic. The problem with continental thought is it tends to be very theoretical and very elaborate, but it's built on very light, how can you say it? It's built on very light, real-life foundations. So they don't have a lot of practical examples, it's all theory. Whereas British thought tends to be heavily built on practical examples with very little theory, compared to European thought. So German idealism is mostly theoretical and like conceptual, and it's very little applied thought, which makes it weak, because what if that one example you give me doesn't work? Then the whole thing collapses. We'll probably do more additional on that as we go forward. I just wanted to mention that weakness. That's a good question. All right. So let's get into this. Capital. So this is basically starting. This is a critique of capitalism and profit. At the most basic, that's what this book is. So let me read this quote I was going to give you. Here we go. Here we go. So I'm going to quote from Mandel. What Marx's Capital explained, however, was above all the ruthless and irresistible impulse to growth which characterizes production for private profit, and the predominant use of profit for capital accumulation. Since Marx wrote, capitalist technology and industry have indeed spread all over the world. As they have done so, moreover, not only have material wealth and all the possibilities for freeing mankind definitively from the burden of meaningless, repetitive and mechanical work increased, but so too has the polarization of society between fewer and fewer owners of capital and more workers of hand and brain, forced to sell their labor power to their owners. And then to give you where the concentration of wealth and power in a small number of giant industrial and financial corporations has brought with it an increasingly universal struggle between capital and labor. And he makes this really early point, right? He points this out. Labor is, quote, forced to sell to owners. Now, what does this mean? We'll get into what he means by this. But for a Marxist, they really believe that anybody who sells their labor, you're forced to sell. And we'll get into the dynamics of how you're forced to sell. But also for a Marxist, basically the foundation of reality almost is this: a universal struggle between capital and labor. Now, if you've never heard capital, right, capital is people who have extra cash money to invest in business. And then they're also the ones who get the profit from businesses. Labor would be people who work for a wage, and that's how you live. So for Marxists, this is kind of the base fundamental of reality. And then very early, we get kind of Mandel's quote here. He says, this is in the 70s, by the way, talk of the heyday of capitalism being over and the, quote, inevitable contradictions will destroy it. So this is generally seen by Marxists as a, what would you say? This is always the big critique. So capitalism's over, there's inevitable contradictions, they will destroy it. What they mean is the system itself isn't healthy and will eventually eat itself. Now I want to make a note, this is again a me note, it's not in the book. Capitalism itself is a purely Marxist conception. The word capitalism is Marxist. It didn't exist before Marx, and when you use the word capitalism, you're actually using a Marxist concept. So this being forced to sell to owners, and you're being exploited by profit by capitalists for your wage labor, that is capitalism. Now, a person who likes free markets would just say it's markets working, not capitalism. But again, Marxists have been so effective. Opponents of Marxism use Marxist terminology to show their opponents, just to give you this kind of like how influential Marx has been in the last 120, 130, 140 years, is his terminology gets used by his enemies. Just to show you, like, wow, he's very influential. Yes. And if you have any questions so far, I'm gonna get a second drink. So you got about 10 seconds to write something. But yeah, this is just the very beginning of the intro. Sadly, not a beer, just a sparkling water. All right. And let's see. Oh, and I want to point out too, right? So I made a side note that I almost missed. The implication of this universal struggle, by the way, is that workers don't strictly. Remember we talked about will and determinism. That workers strictly have no will. Things are done to them, right? They're forced to sell their labor. They're part of this universal struggle. Why? Well, Marxists at the foundation are material determinists. They think everything is determined by the material reality you're in, and will is an illusion of your material reality. Now, they'll contradict themselves a little bit later, but I'll get into that when they do it. For now, let's keep going. All right, so the purpose of this book. What is the purpose of Capital? Why did he write it? What is it doing? Okay, so first, the aim of this book, and to quote, is to lay bare the laws of motion that govern the origin and course of capitalism. So again, remember, the good thing to know right away, we say the laws of motion that talk about the origin and course of capitalism. There is a strong scientific bent here in Marxism. Marxists see themselves as basically human scientists. So they think if they understand laws of basically how the motion works, they can diagnose always how things will work. So there's let's see. So, for example, I'll read my comment at the end, but definitely they see themselves as scientists. So, this is again a quote from the intro. Each form of socioeconomic organization has its own set of laws. So, whenever Marxism, they basically say each system has different sets of laws, and they change as you go through these systems. So, the purpose of this book is to specifically explain capitalism, but you have to at least mention the other socioeconomic organizations. And you remember those, I mentioned words that we use that are purely Marxist words? Socioeconomic is only a Marxist word. Like when you use that, you're basically carrying water for Marxists. Because this is what socioeconomic means. It means the laws that govern each form of production. So for example, feudalism, which we talked about already with Tokugawa, right? It's that production from land, a land-based feudal society. Capitalism, production from capital, right? Socialism, you're like, what's that production from society? Well, we'll talk about what socialism is later in the socialist dynamic. And primitivism, this is interesting. This is the, like, hunter-gatherer or pastoral society. Now, a little op-ed before we move on. These are the two So basically, these are the two the Marxists hate more. These are the two they like better. Basically, if you're going to rank them, worst, capitalism. Best, socialism. Not so bad, primitivism. And better than capitalism, feudalism. So it'd be like best, next best, kind of bad, worst. So for Marxists, we're always in one of these socioeconomic statuses, and then each one has its own rules. So, like, for example, something that doesn't work in feudalism, it doesn't disprove their critique of capitalism, because they would just say, oh, that's a different set of rules. So, but for example, to give you a contrast, like a free market thinker or just a market economist would say, the laws of markets work no matter what kind of production you have. So that's a point of disagreement. Now, before you ask, why are we kind of studying like production theory? Well, this is what Mandel says, right? No pure economic theory exists, since it cannot be separated from society. That's why the word socioeconomic exists. For Marxists, everything's determined by the material, so therefore, nothing is free. Like, society can't be free from the economics, because everything is determined by material, and what is economics? It's how we get our material, right? So if I'm a farmer, that's my material reality, which makes my society. So they attribute all cause to economics. So you can never separate society and economics. So for example, let's say you're doing an art paper in our class. A Marxist would say you can't separate the art from the material means of production. All right. Now, I said means of production, but we can also say mode of production. But for a Marxist, each mode of production has its own laws. And then this changes the causation in that society. So going back to this, right? How you make your living in your socioeconomic conditions changes the laws of the causation of your material. So, for example, the way feudal society will work is different than capitalist, right? Because in a feudal society, most people do what? Farm. And then who's at the top? Basically rent-seeking lords who fight. So each person has kind of their means of production, but the vast majority are farming labor. And why don't Marxists really hate it? Well, at least generally, the peasants own their means of production. But we'll get into that in a second. Capitalism's the worst, because capital does rent-seeking, right, if I own a business, and then laborers just don't own anything, just their time. Socialism is the idea that you own your time, and then primitivism, right, we're all in a hunter-gatherer society sharing everything. So everybody owns everybody's time, kind of. All right. Let's get into what they call historical materialism. Historical materialism is this, understanding that, So understanding that relativity, social determination, and historical limitations of all economic laws. So Marxists, while they are objective, as in they're saying they're using science, they have to say that there is a certain amount of relativity here, because the way you analyze every society in history depends on their means of social economic production, which is a bit of relativistic, right? Like, there's no, like, you can't compare one to one. Also, they tend to be social determinists, right? So society tends to push people where they go. You don't really make your choices. And then there's a historic limitation of all economic laws, because it depends what our means of production is, both on how we analyze other means and which one works for our time. All right. Now this is interesting. For a Marxist, there is no human nature, and no economic laws are universal. So basically, there isn't human nature, there isn't economic laws. They're all derived from material reality, straight up. So humans are made by their material environment. Remember we talked about determinism? So Marxists would say, your human nature, quote unquote, is determined by your socioeconomics. That's it. So your human nature, if you're a feudal, is a farming human nature. Or if you're human nature in our current society, which is capitalist, you have a capitalist human nature. Or if you're a socialist human nature, you have socialist human nature. So they're basically what you'd call like tabula rasa. They think humans are kind of like blank, and then society makes them who they are. Same thing with economic laws. Economic laws change depending on your means of production. So again, a bit of a relativism. But they don't think there's anything such as a universal law per se. So then this comes up, where capitalism is a product of history, so it's historical determinism, basically. Again, going back to historical materialism. So capitalism was made by history, not by people, and it's not like a universal thing that exists, strictly speaking. Because remember, Marxists don't believe in ideas that transcend material. All ideas, which are non-physical, right? All ideas have to come from material things, and they're just a reflection of the matter, basically. If you're like, Professor, this sounds nuts, don't worry, it gets better. Alright. Basically, how do we get to capitalism if it's not made by people or a universal law? Well, they say capitalism historically rises out of commodity production. So, what's a commodity? We'll get into that. But, so to have capitalism for a Marxist, you have to have commodity production. So basically you have to have things that I manufacture to sell outside of my own market. That's kind of the most easy way to explain what a commodity is. Now, they get around their own rules already, saying the concept of echoes in pre-capitalist modes. So if you call something, say in feudal society, that looks pre-capitalist, you can then call it an echo of capitalism and then analyze it with these Marxist rules. That's how they get around their own trap, basically. Now, Marx says this, and Mandel recapitulates it, like he agrees. If you read Capital, a Marxist and a true Marxist would say this: you cannot separate scientific Marxism from revolutionary Marxism. And I say type, but they're for a Marxist, there's not a difference. If you understand scientific Marxism, you must be a revolutionary Marxist. There's not like a moderate Marxist. It can't exist. If anything, a Marxist would just say, that's you waiting to get power. It's not a genuine position. Because why? They believe if you understand these rules, to ignore them would be insanity. So, once you understand quote-unquote scientific Marxism, you have to be a revolutionary. Alright. Now, what is Marx's goal according to himself? Well, he says his goal is to discover objective laws of motion. Again, this sounds like physics, if you've ever studied physics. And Marx, and a lot of 20th century Marxists, specifically put themselves in a scientific framework. They think they're doing basically human science. Now, my note I have here to point out, I would generally say this is a pseudoscience. So while you can say the system itself attempts to be philosophically scientific, that basically what I mean is, to quote another philosopher called Bertrand Russell, they're trying to allow their proofs, their evidence has to be proved with empirical reality. However, it has beliefs and assumptions that are not proved from the data and must be believed. There's basically basic beliefs underneath Marxism, which I would call that it's not pure science, right? They have their own metaphysics and epistemology and belief systems. So it's not, Marxists say it's just a science, but it actually has its own buy-ins you have to believe too. So, alright, technically we've got 5 minutes, but I think I've been going for 50. So I'm going to leave it here for questions. If you have questions, you can ask in the stream first. And if you don't have any stream questions, then I'll end the stream and I'll give us a couple minutes of a send-off and we'll go home. Any questions? I'll give you guys like 30 seconds to ask me. And yes, that is a microwave in the background. Okay, here we got a first question. It does sound like superphysics. Does he have influence among physics, like Murphy's laws derived from Marxist thought? Okay, yes. So here, you ready? So, the big three of the 19th century were, and they all worked together, and they all reinforced each other. It was Marx in social sciences and politics, and it was Freud in psychology, and Darwin in science. And they all build off each other. Now, why do I point that out? A Darwinist worldview is a Marxist worldview applied to science. Yes, I know, somebody's giving me a bunch of oh my goodness faces. And as we go, I'll explain how that correlation works. But basically, evolutionary science is Marxist science. If that makes sense. It's material science, right? if you think about the arguments, it's you're arguing no for no God. You're arguing that everything has a material cause, right? The Big Bang. Things made themselves out of matter, right, with no external input. So, and by the way, these go hand in hand with atheism. You can't really be a Marxist and, like, if you're, I've gotten in arguments with professors before. You can't be a Marxist and a Christian. You really have to pick one, because you're either a bad Marxist or a bad Christian. Because a Marxist doesn't think there's external causes, right? And what's God? He's an external cause. That doesn't work, right? But a Marxist also can't. So a Christian can't believe there's no external causes. I mean, unless they're a cultural Christian, right? But you can't believe in an external cause of a God and that everything's material. One of those things have to be true. So again, if you're a Christian, you're a Marxist, you can believe it if you want. I'm just saying it's not philosophically consistent. That's the point. Yeah, that was a really good question. Any other questions? But yeah, we'll get into that interplay more as we go. But yeah, these are the kind of the big three of modern philosophy, science, psychology. They're all linked together because they're all using similar causation determinist assumptions in all of their thinking. So they're basically those beliefs I was talking about. Marx, Freud, and Darwin use the same underlying assumptions, all of them. They just make different conclusions in different fields. And since we're in the humanities and social sciences, we're using the humanities social sciences version, but we could do the same thing for Darwin, and I'll drop it when it makes sense. All right, I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to end the stream for now. There's not a conclusion slide. Why? Because next time we're jumping right back in at the materialist dialectic. Thanks for watching. If you're not a student, that means we have spring break next week, so we'll be back in 2 weeks on Tuesday. For everybody else, we'll say bye in the chat and have a good spring break. All right, thanks for listening.